Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the CEO for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar today, Productive Struggle with Complex Texts. This webinar is brought to you in part with sponsorship with Burlington English. So I'm going to turn this over to our friend, Robert Breitbart, who's going to share a few slides with you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Sharon. And again, to everyone, so great to be here with you today. Hope this webinar is greeting you and you're safe and you're healthy. Thank you ever so much for all you're doing for your learners and adult education. Just know with Burlington English, we are thrilled to be with you every step of the way. So that now that we've gone to remote serving of students, just know that whether it's on their smartphones, their tablets, their Chromebooks, whatever kind of device they have, Burlington English is right there for them. And for your teachers, 100% of any device that they have, they can connect 100% with all of their learners. So regardless of what you're emphasizing, what you're looking to emphasize, so again, whether it's getting a job and all the aspects needed for resumes and interview skills, once they have that job, the job retention, the soft skills needed to keep that job and to advance. And then for all of us, how early can we get our ELL learners preparing for IET or IELCE or post-secondary transition? So just know that we do that even all the way down to the beginning levels. Get all of your ESL learners ready for life after ESL. And then whether it's IELCE or just civics and citizenship in general, we've got you covered on all of that. And obviously at a time that we're doing remote assessment and looking at remote ways to do intake and orientations, digital literacy has never been so critical. So we have you covered fully on that. Also, if you are looking to act now on recruiting new learners into your program, please check out our website for our Student Recruitment Kit webinar that we're putting on. So if you attend this webinar for free of charge, we'll customize and create for you all sorts of items that you can use for student recruitment. So again, this is customized whether you use Burlington English or not. Just simply please join us for a really highly engaging and I promise you fun webinar. And you can find this information just at our website at burlingtonenglish.com. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sharon, and I'll remind everybody, if you haven't gotten your copy of the COAVE Journal, you owe it to yourself. Go to Amazon. It is a great read, stuff you can use right away. And by the way, you're really going to enjoy watching our presenter today, Anita. They do some phenomenal work. They're in Central Illinois, and you'll want to check out her and her team. They're also presenting at the virtual conference, which I understand COAVE is holding a virtual national conference. So with that, thank you so much, Sharon Bonney.
Thank you, Robert. And I just want to say, Burlington English has been such a wonderful partner over all these years. They were the first partner to sponsor our webinars, and so grateful for that. Here we are. I want to mention, as of just 2 days ago, when I checked, we've had almost 30,000 that have signed up for webinars since COVID-19. And so Robert and I, we laughed because our first webinar ever together, we had 72 on, and we were both so nervous, right? It was a big deal. We were super nervous. It's exciting to grow together, and I'm really excited to see all the offerings that Burlington English has. I mean, even this recent one with helping the adult learners to come into the program, student recruitment, that's huge. So just encourage you to check their products out. And they are going to be a sponsor and an exhibitor at our national conference as well.
Thank you for the kind.
Thanks, Robert. So Robert mentioned our COAVE Journal. Super excited about this. This is available on the Amazon Kindle as well as on Shopify. And I do just want to encourage you that this is written by and for practitioners. So just written by and for people just like you, with a lot of great innovative articles in there. So that's available, as I said, at coave.org on Amazon Kindle or on Shopify. After the webinar, everybody will receive a certificate of participation. You'll also be able to access the slides and the resources on our adult educators repository within 48 hours. As well, our national conference. So Robert mentioned that we took our national conference virtual because the city of Baltimore had closed down to groups of more than 250 people all the way through the end of August. So rather than not do the conference, we took it virtual, and we're expecting about 4,000 people. So I want to encourage you, if you've not done so yet, If you're registered for the conference, you can bring a guest free of charge. Just go to coabe.org for more details of that. And now today, I'd like to introduce you or reintroduce you to Anita Kerr. Many of you remember her from our presentation last week. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Anita. Anita?
Thank you. It's good to be here with you all today. I'm going to start sharing my slides, and as I do so, I'd just like to say thank you to COABE for inviting me to present. And as Robert said, I am going to be presenting at the National Virtual Conference, and that's always exciting to be a part of. So I just want to congratulate all of you who are still out there actively trying to still learn and develop and train as you're working on your own professional development. And I want to laud you for that. And what we're going to do today is certainly relevant whether you are teaching at a distance or whether you're teaching face-to-face coming up in this fall. No matter your situation, this is relevant. And so I'm really grateful that you're here. We're going to be moving pretty quickly through a section of the session here on complex text. And then we're going to slow down a little bit in the second half and really concentrate on the issue of productive struggle. So with that, I'm going to jump right in and we're going to get to the meat of our session. So let's start with complex text. The idea here is, what is complex text? Why do we have to worry about complex text? Well, for example, there's been a shift in adult education over the last several years. You are familiar with college and career readiness standards, the HSE exams, required assessments such as TABE and CASAS. All of those things require us to present students with complex text and provide our students with the tools to comprehend those texts. So what is it that we actually mean when we talk about complex text? So we're going to talk about these three areas very briefly: definition, the value of teaching complex text, and also we'll talk about the challenges as well. So what do we mean when we talk about complex text? Well, what we don't mean is just simply text that is hard, right? Material to read that is going to be hard for students. That's not really the definition. The definition here that you'll see on the screen really includes ideas that are where a text is tied into usually a larger unit or a larger lesson where you're trying to teach specific standards or curricular goals. And also the complex text represents an appropriate level of challenge for those students. And that key word appropriate, we are going to talk about because there's a little bit of a question mark there, right? About what is the appropriate level. And we'll get to that. Our Common Core state standards in this country state that students leaving high school should be able to read and comprehend complex text independently and proficiently. And we know that our adult ed students who are coming out of that K-12 system often don't have those skills to a sufficient extent. So we are working towards getting our students to that goal. So what kind of qualities would you find in complex text? If I said, you know, the definition is this, but what would it look like? Here are some examples. This list of qualities comes from Doug Buell. He wrote a book called Developing Readers in the Academic Disciplines from 2011. It's an excellent book. And this is his list. And he specifically talks about how a complex text will be dense. It will often contain references and allusions outside of the text itself. Another key point, it's going to follow multiple text structures, meaning it's not just a compare-contrast, for instance, right? But it might use compare-contrast within the text, and it's also going to use other structures. Complicated sentence structure and sophisticated vocabulary, this is going to be an issue, right? And then also this last bullet, which is very important, this idea that you're going to have to infer the author's purpose. And by that, we mean the student will not just be able to read the text and understand exactly what is being said. They're going to have to put their brain in it a little bit. So what I want you to do, I'm going to launch a poll here on the screen, and you can click right on the screen. I want you to know, in your experience, which of these options here, which of these qualities of complex text cause your students the most difficulty when they're working through a text? which one of those qualities of a text will cause your students the most difficulty? And I'll give you a few minutes to vote there. Again, you can just click right on the screen. And we'll see what kind of the consensus answer is here as we go. Great, I appreciate all the votes. Wonderful. We've got it looks like a close tie here. Yeah, so this is interesting. So I want you to look at that list on the poll again, and I want you to think what you decide in your mind, which one do you think everybody's gonna pick, okay? And I'm gonna end the poll and I'm gonna share it with you. Here's our answer. By a nudge, that need for inference, 40% of you say that's the part that's gonna give my students the most trouble. But look what's second. That's sentence structure and vocabulary. In other words, the language of the text is what's going to cause those troubles for students. Not that the other issues aren't problematic in some cases, but this is where you guys feel your students struggle the most. That's wonderful. I appreciate that. And what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about a couple of things that we can do to maybe help us over those hurdles as we work to give students complex text. Now, I do want to say, that all of those qualities can be challenging, but one thing that happens that will sometimes cause us more problems is we tend to provide students in our classrooms with these very short paragraph length texts. They often serve great purposes in our classrooms, but only giving one skill-focused paragraph length texts is very restrictive, and we can't just stop there. What if, instead of giving multiple short one paragraph readings to teach a single skill, what if I gave students a lengthier, complex text that was rich in content, and I asked them to do multiple things with that one text? Here's an example for you. I went online and looked for a good primary source, and I found this speech by President George Bush on the evening of September 11th, 2001. This is an excerpt of that speech. It's an important primary text. It's rich in relevant, high interest content, and it's long enough that it requires a little bit of a deeper dive than just a one paragraph reading, right? And so this is an example. We're going to come back to this text here in a little bit, but I wanted to show you that I'm not talking about pages and pages and pages long text. A complex text can be brief enough that it's accessible to your lower level readers, but it's longer than just that one paragraph, one skill focused reading. So let's talk about the value of using complex text. Why is it important? Okay, well, first of all, that is what our standards in adult ed require of us, okay? We are required to teach to the standards. And one of the main shifts in the language arts adult education standards is the move toward understanding complex text and academic vocabulary. That's part of what has created this need for the increased rigor in what our students need to be able to do. Now, there's another value to using complex text in that it prepares our students for the rigorous work that they're going to be exposed to in college and or post-secondary workforce programs. And we are tasked with preparing our students to move to that transition stage, right? They're not going to stay with us forever. Our adult ed goal is to transition them next. And whatever that is, we need to be preparing them for the rigor of that work. We will be doing our students a disservice if we withhold difficult material because they think they're going to struggle with it. It's our job to prepare them for challenges like college level work or post-secondary training programs. We just have to do that with the appropriate supports in place, which we are going to talk about here in just a second. And lastly, the idea of using complex text, it saves time in your classroom. If you select one really rich, complex text to study for the day, and you use it to teach main idea, and you do vocabulary instruction, and you talk about author's purpose, and you mention text structure, and you have them trace the arguments, claim, and evidence, all with the same text, you have saved them from having to read multiple short passages from multiple sources, right? You present one rich, longer text and spend time doing several read-throughs, letting students really deep dive And that's an approach that allows you to teach multiple skills with that one text. So that leads us to our third introductory idea here about complex text, and that is the challenges. So I don't want you to think that I'm sitting here saying, oh, this is fine, it's easy to do this. No, no, no. We can expect our students to struggle. So one thing I want you to do is read the quote that's on the screen, and I want you to try to finish it. How can I expect my students to succeed in reading complex texts when? I want you to finish that sentence in your mind for your classroom, your students. Some of you may be thinking, how can I do this when I have reluctant readers? How can I do this when my students are lower level? How can I do this when, right? This is the idea that we've got lots and lots and lots of questions going on in our mind when we think about doing something complicated like this for our students. Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat a couple people, they have limited life experience. Some are very distracted by their life experience right now, working with refugees or pre-literate students. Students who don't trust themselves. Yeah, I see a lot of great responses here. Students who can decode, but their comprehension is not there to back it up. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate those responses. I think all of those are legitimate. I want to acknowledge the fact that those are there. And we are going to address some of these as we go ahead. Let's begin with the most obvious challenge in my mind, which is how am I supposed to be selecting appropriately complex text for my students, right? That's a challenge. So how do I do it? So let's talk about the how. And you may be very familiar with the image that you see on the screen right now of that triangle. These are the three components of measuring text complexity, and we're going to just kind of breeze through this pretty fast. But I want you to recognize that this three-part graphic is representing the idea that evaluating text complexity is not a simple one-step process that's going to produce the exact same results for every teacher that does it. This is not just a mathematical formula that you get one right answer. There are measures in place, though, to help us evaluate text, and it is more than just a number. So let's talk about what it looks like. If you're familiar with the concept of quantitative and qualitative complexity, we're going to start with quantitative. This is the idea that you're measuring the text for its readability through some sort of computer algorithm or a formula, right? You're measuring the number of syllables and words per line, or you're measuring the length of the words, the lengths of the paragraphs, etc. You might be familiar with Lexile or grade level or ATOS levels. These all are quantitative measures of a text. But qualitative, on the other hand, is different. Qualitative asks the teacher to analyze the text and then ask themselves, what components of the text would my students find challenging? As opposed to measuring readability, qualitative measures evaluates the structure of a text, the language and knowledge demands, and the purpose. And then you have to decide with which one of those components will my students struggle the most. Now, the tools that we would use to measure quantitative and qualitative complexity in a text are different. For quantitative, I put two tools up there, readable.io and lexile.com. These are free available resources that you can use online. For the qualitative, we're going to look at qualitative rubric here in just a second, and I will show it to you. But let's start with that quantitative measure. Here's a screenshot of readable.io. This is a very simple website. You cut and paste text from a website or from some document you have. You paste it in here, and it runs a readability measure for you. Readable.io, you can sign up for a free account, and it will give you, I believe, 10 runs in a week, something like that. There's a limit to it, but you can use it occasionally on the free account, or you can have a very inexpensive paid account. It's just a couple of dollars a month. I have put that George Bush speech from 2001 in here, and I ran the readability, and it gave me, if you'll notice, a Flesch-Kincaid grade level. That is the readability measure that I tend to use most often in my classroom. because Lexile is not as familiar to me, so I like the grade level measure. So that 8.8 is what I'm looking for as a teacher. That's telling me that about an 8.8, 8th year, 8th month grade student should be able to access this text pretty okay. They should be able to comprehend it without much support. That gives me an idea of an approximate grade level if I were going to use this in my adult ed class, right? Now, again, if you're more comfortable with Lexile, Lexile.com is also available for that function. So let's say you've run that quantitative measure of a text, and now you're going to look at the qualitative. So let's talk about a qualitative analysis rubric. This chart is showing how each of the 4 components of text that we're going to measure, structure, language, knowledge, demands, and purpose. And it asks the teacher to rate each component as either slightly, moderately, very, or exceedingly complex based on the criteria that's provided. Measuring qualitatively is a little more subjective than a quantitative measure provided by a computer, but there's still some very clear criteria here by which to measure how difficult each component of the text is going to be for your students. One quick thing I want to point out that's written on your screen here in the white text, you're asking yourself which components of the text would be difficult for students who read at the same level of this text, okay? And by that we mean, I'm not saying my lowest level students, would they find this text difficult? Remember, my George Bush speech was an 8.8 grade level. So when I evaluate that George Bush speech for qualitative, I ask myself, would about an 8th grade level of reader find this section of the text complicated and complex? Okay, so that's how this works. Now, this is a small font, and this is obviously going to be hard for you to read, but this document has been included for everyone who registered for the webinar. That document either came with your registration email or it will come with your certificate. So you will have a copy of this document. And it comes from Octay's Standards in Action training that Illinois was a part of. And we incorporate this rubric into all of our standards proficient training throughout the state. And I would encourage you to examine it, check it out, and use it when you're selecting text. We're going to play with this for just a minute. I'm going to give you that George Bush speech again, that excerpt, and I want you to skim it, okay? Don't read every word, skim. And in just a second at the top, I'm going to put the section of the rubric that I want you to evaluate it for, okay, which is going to be purpose. So skim the text, and you remember, you're going to ask yourself, how complex would my students find the purpose of this text? All right, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let you read. I've put the chart at the top where you can decide how you would measure the purpose of this text. So I'll give you just a second to take a look for you to decide whether this text, the purpose of it is slightly, moderately, very, or exceedingly complex. So it's okay if you didn't get all the way through. I want to model for you how this would work, okay? I've read through my text. I'm looking at my qualitative analysis chart, and I'm going to concentrate on the purpose section, and I'm going to ask myself, okay, what do I think? How complex would about an 8th grade reader find this? And I'm seeing in the chat quite a range, actually, all the way from slightly to very, although many of you are falling on the moderately section. Yeah, I would agree with that. Remember, purpose, look at the moderate purpose criteria. The purpose is implied, but it's pretty easy to identify based on the context, okay? So the idea is it really theoretical and implicit and subtle? Or do you think it's fairly obvious to infer, even if it's not overtly stated, right? That's what it's asking. And so if you fell kind of in the moderately category, I would agree with that. But again, I do want to say it might be a little different for everybody. And I want to show you why. This third piece of the triangle is reader and task considerations. So let's think, why might some teachers look at that George Bush speech and rate it more on the very complex for purpose as opposed to more moderate? What if they have a room full of students, maybe about 8th grade reading level, but what if they're all, what if they're not Native American? What if they weren't born here? What if they don't know American history? So they would lack that understanding, and maybe that gap would create a greater distance for them to get to the comprehension, right? Whereas somebody who was born here and who studied American history, and that event is more common in their mind, right? They jump to it. So that reader and task consideration brings to bear our decisions about how much support we need to provide before or during giving a complex text to our classrooms, okay? You may have a text about the internet and social media, but you have a lot of older students in your classroom who aren't digital natives. They may find a text about social media just baffling, whereas your younger students may get it right away, right? So those are those extra considerations of reader and task. And every classroom, every lesson is different. And you as the teacher will bring your expertise to bear on that lesson and that text you're bringing. And I trust that you can do it. But hopefully that qualitative analysis chart will help you recognize which area do I need to give my students some more support. All right. Now, let's ask ourselves another hard question, okay? Let's move to the idea of, okay, this complex text is fine. I kind of know how I would select it, but I have a multi-level class. You might be thinking, Anita, this is all well and good, but have you seen my class? Well, and I will tell you, I teach at a local community college, a night class, and I have a multi-level class too. So can this be done? Can one text be all things to all people in your room? Maybe. I will say maybe. Does it take work? Yes. But we're going to talk about what that might be like. Even if you do have a leveled class, I will just say maybe you have all ASC learners, all high school level readers in your room. They're still at multi-level, right? Because they have varying degrees of skills. So let's talk for a second about how you can address a multi-level classroom. Now, depending on your students, you might be able to choose one text that strikes enough of a middle ground that you can have everybody read the same text and then differentiate your questions and activities, right? You will occasionally find that, a text everyone can read, and you simply differentiate your questions and add supportive strategies for your lower levels and challenge questions for your higher levels, right? Occasionally that will work. Another approach you can use is to try to jigsaw your text, right? If you're not familiar with that concept, this is when you cut a text into 3 sections, for instance, and you have groups of students each reading and summarizing one section, and then they share out and teach it to the rest of the group, right? This is another kind of strategy approach that might work if you're afraid to give an entire complex text to your students at once. Another option when you're using one text with a whole class is to chunk it into pieces. And you might choose to give the whole text to your highest readers. And maybe you only give a selected section to your lower level readers. Maybe just the beginning. You ask them to tackle just the introduction and you adjust your questions accordingly. Certainly that's going to take some advanced planning, but it might be worth it for your students still to all be dealing with the same text for your lesson, right? And the last suggestion here I'll give you is if you're using one text in a multi-level class is just provide a scaffold of some kind for those who need it. A graphic organizer, paragraph numbers and highlighting on certain copies of the text, playing the audio for students who need to listen along while they read. You can let your higher level readers tackle that text without the scaffolding, but you can provide it for the ones who do need it. And this is a great concept that might work for you. So I'll throw those ideas up here on the screen. You can kind of see again a quick review of those strategies. Now, no one is saying that these are easy. They certainly take time, but think about the opposite. If you've got a multi-level class and you're not trying some of these things, you're just giving one text to a multi-level class with no supports or grouping or jigsawing. It's either going to leave people lost or bored or both. And we don't want to swing to the other side of the extreme either, where we're only giving independent work to each student at his or her level, right? That group work, that class work is so worthwhile, and it's necessary for teaching those listening, speaking, and collaborative group skills that our college and career readiness standards require. So what else could we do if we're thinking, okay, this using the same text with a multi-level class, I don't think that's going to work for me. Do we have another alternative? Well, yes. You could also use multiple texts at different grade levels and group your students by grade level, right, and give them different text. In this approach, every group of students are reading a different text at a different grade level that's appropriate for them, right? Now, it's tough to find leveled text on the same or similar topics. I acknowledge that fully. So what are some options? Well, Newsela, you may be familiar with, Newsela. That is a great resource offering multiple lexiles for the same text. But I will say it's no longer a free service. It does use a subscription fee now for everything except the current events resource collection on its basic homepage. So you can visit Newsela and take a look at their current events section and look at the different lexile offerings there. And then readworks.org is another resource that does have some leveled texts. And on the ReadWorks site, it's called their Step Reads feature. Step Reads feature. And that does have some, it'll have a text, and then it'll offer a couple of less complex versions of that article written by the ReadWorks staff, where it preserves the original knowledge and the academic vocabulary from the original article, but it alters the word count and the difficulty. So there are a couple of options out there that I would just encourage you to take a look at. If giving one text to your whole class seems not doable, then try to find a different lexiled approach, a different text at the different lexile levels and use it. I see in the chat several of you are saying, yes, 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 I've used ReadWorks. Yes, I've tried some of these options. Yeah, and I would say too, trying is that's a place that we need to start, right? Try it. Not everything is going to work in every classroom. I fully recognize that we're all very different. Our students are very different, and the way you approach your teaching is different, and that's okay. So try something and see what you think. If it doesn't work, try something else, right? That's the goal of this kind of presentation, where I'm kind of throwing a whole bunch of different strategies and resources at you. I would never expect someone to walk away and try them all. I say try one, see what happens, and then maybe try something else after. So that takes us to kind of our second half. And look at that clock. We're doing well if we're working on halves, right? Productive struggle. This is the other idea. If I'm going to give complex text to my students, I know as a teacher that this will not be easy for them, nor will it be easy for me, right? So I put up a phrase here at the bottom of this slide, desirable difficulty. That's another way to think about productive struggle. If one of those phrases kind of resonates for you, both of those terms mean basically the same thing. And this idea of desirable or productive with what tends to be a negative term following it, that's tricky for our students. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, is how I can focus on building productive struggle in my classroom. So let's start with the fact that this is going to take a mind shift, both for our students and for us as the teacher. Now, I'm going to call out some of you, dear, dear people, my dear adult eds. I know that some of you are softies. You've got the big heart. You love your students. You want them to succeed so badly. You want to smooth the path for them. You want to see them succeed, and I support all of that. But what it does sometimes is it keeps us from allowing our students to productively struggle, because we often have strategies that we apply because we care about our students so much that are actually counterproductive. So we know that this is going to be hard on our students, also challenging for us too. So because students tend to equate struggle with failure, we often tend to jump in and interpret it for them if they're having trouble with a text. Now we know this is true, don't we? We avoid telling students what a complex text means. That's what we need to do, because oftentimes we jump in and we interpret it for them. We explain what it means right away, instead of letting them struggle with it a little bit first and see if they can figure it out for themselves. You know that the value of learning is not just in the outcome, it's in the process. And we have to demonstrate that by letting our students struggle a little bit. Another thing to think about is not stepping in too early or too often. Now, I want you to think about your own classroom here for just a second. I want you to be as honest with yourself as you can for just a second. How often do you think you step in too early or too often, right? When that student who is struggling needs you. If we jump in too early and too often, what we're doing, and I like this phrase in the bottom half of that box, we strip away the intellectual heavy lifting from our students, and they lose the chance to really learn because we have jumped in and done the work for them, right? Yeah, this is hard. And some of you are in the chat asking like, well, how long am I supposed to let them struggle? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But I think that does depend on the student a little bit, right? Some of your students will handle this better than others. And I would never advocate that you just leave a student alone until they figure it out, right? That's not the message here. But the message is to think about your own practice and to think, how often do I literally let my students, after they've asked a question, do I say to them, I want you to try it for a couple minutes on your own before you jump in and show them the right answer? Think about that just for a minute, how you tend to handle that, and do you let the students do the intellectual heavy lifting for themselves? That's what college work, that's what workplace work, parenting, a lot of aspects of life in the future, they're going to have to do the thinking for themselves. Nobody's going to give them the answer. So are we letting them do that thinking? And then this last box is just really a reminder that real learning tends to happen when you have to work a little bit. When there's a little bit of complication or confusion and you have to kind of work your way through it, that's often where the learning happens for our students. And those are, yeah, somebody in the chat just said problem solving skills. That's exactly what it is. That's right. I can persist here. That's one of the key concepts in the math standards, right? For CCR, that persistence, right, towards a difficult task. That's something we need to be teaching our students. And again, this is a workplace skill. This is a life skill. So there's good value in trying to teach our students this beyond just getting them through a complex text, right? But that's the frame in which we're using productive struggle today. So let's talk about that question of how long am I supposed to let my students struggle? Okay, so I love this image of this person being buried underneath their work, and all they can do is hold up the little help sign, right? And I get it that many students feel this way. The question is, have we ever produced a culture in our room where students recognize that when they start to struggle, they have to look to themselves for their help first? Or do they automatically look to the teacher to give them the answer? That's the question I want you to start debating in your mind. When you answer a question for a student, are you bringing strategy to them that will allow them to have a skill and a knowledge that they can then apply in the future? Or did you just bring them quote unquote salvation where now they know the right answer? This is the whole idea, right? About, give a man a fish, he eats for the day, right? Give him a fishing pole and teach him to fish, he can do it for his lifetime. Same idea. And you know this. I know you know this. I'm preaching to the choir, right? But I do want you to stop and think about your practice again. When students ask a question, do you point them to their own skills and strategies that they should have in order to answer the question, or do you help them find the answer, right? And maybe you think to yourself, well, what if my student doesn't have that strategy yet? And then maybe the way you answer the question is to point them to that new strategy that they don't have. And maybe that becomes a lesson coming up in the future, right? We don't want to step in too often. We don't want to step in too early, and we don't want to stop their thinking. And I think this is probably where I use the when is it time to step in. Depending on the student, my guideline would be when you see that the student's progress toward learning or towards figuring it out has stopped. Whether that's through their motivation has gone, their frustration is high, right? Whatever the reasoning is, but if their forward motion has stopped, it's time to step in, right? I think that's a fair statement. And certainly some of your students, you know their emotional lives a little bit better. And so you certainly know when you're going to some of them. So let's think practically then about this idea of productive struggle. What kinds of things could you do? Well, you're going to want to ask good questions and the right kinds of questions. And I love this first point here. What questions are going to help you narrow the area of struggle? Think about this for a minute. How many of you have ever had a student who just says, I don't get it, right? They just literally are throwing their hands up in the air. I don't get it. And that's their response. And your sometimes reaction is to step over there and help them right away. But what if instead you asked a question that narrowed their area of struggle down so that you saw actually what they were frustrated with, not the throwing up in the air of the hands, but the, I don't get this question about main idea. Okay, now I can get them to focus on their struggle area, right? So asking the right question and then at the right time. Again, this is the idea of when they've reached the end of forward motion, help them then when they're really frustrated or stuck, but let them actually try to do some work before you jump in. Look at this encouragement. I called some of you out earlier for being softies, and I say that with a big smile on my face, I promise, because I love adult educators with all my heart. But we do tend to be a little overly supportive sometimes when probably we need to back up and let them do the work. So let's definitely encourage our students, but let's encourage them to focus on the process, the work, the reflective practice that they need as they're learning, not just the outcome or the correct answer. And that's hard. You guys, I've had students in my classroom who are, 1 or 2 subject areas away from passing their HSE exam, and they just want to know, is it A, B, C, or D to get this one right on my practice test, and I get that desire on their part, but we still know that we have a greater goal in mind, which is their ultimate learning, right? And yes, I'm seeing that in the chat, absolutely. Sometimes the student just wants the outcome, and it's our job partly to help them see that the learning process is more than that, right? Allowing time. This is a great thing to think about in your own practice. How often do you let students have time before you expect an answer from them, before you expect a response? Students need to do the work, so try not to step in too early. And then the acknowledging. Talk to your students about struggle. Tell them that, hey, let you struggle a little bit with this before I jump in. That's okay, but it's okay to explain it to them, that that's what you're actually doing. And just tell them, having something told to you or explained to you is not the same thing as learning. And I want you to learn. So you can explain to them the process behind your thinking and why you might be doing things a little differently right now than you have in the past. So that takes us to a related thought, which is stamina. I want to talk about reading stamina for just a second, which is one of the reasons why your students don't productively struggle, because they don't have this, okay? And I think just like talking to them about productive struggle, it's very important to talk to your students about reading stamina. You need to tell them, this is a marathon. You're not going to get this right away. You're not going to be able to read texts of this complexity or this length so easily right away. This will take work. And so we are on, week 1 of our marathon training right now. And by the end of this, we're going to get to training to be ready to run that quote unquote marathon of your HSE test, or whatever it might be in their case. This is important. I talk to my students about this, and I do tell them that this is when they say, what does this text have to do with my GED, right? Or why am I studying this? What does it have to do with my GED? Often I will tell them, I am developing your stamina as a reader. Whether the subject matter is important to you or not, the length of the text, the complexity of the text is getting you prepped for those HSE kinds of reading. So it can help them with their motivation if you help show the connections between stamina and complexity. And that leads us to this chart, which I just love and is not a scientific chart, by the way. But what it does is it just reminds us that our students are bringing to those complex texts, not just a grade level ability, and maybe a productive struggle mindset or not, but they're also bringing emotions with them from maybe previous experiences in school or previous experiences as a reader. This academic emotion idea is very much entwined with students' willingness to pursue their task. If students think that they're not capable or they anticipate failure in reading, then their willingness to participate is diminished, right? This makes complete sense. Think about yourself for a minute. Think about something that you really love doing, like a hobby, something you love spending your free time on. That thing that you love to do is probably something you're really good at. How many of you enjoy doing things that you're bad at, right? This isn't very logical to us. I don't want to spend time doing things I'm bad at. Your students who think or are poor readers, they don't want to read because they don't think they're good at it. And so we have to acknowledge that and talk to them about how the reading process equates and relates to their life, right? If you can connect what they're reading or the process of reading to their real life, they might find more motivation to move over to the left side of this chart a little bit. So, and this is really a key component of our adult education andragogy anyway. Contextualizing learning for students in something that's real for them, that's valuable. And students will be more engaged, more active learners when you make the connection between who they are and what they're learning and where it's going to get them, right? So we want to get them over there to that left side. And so the more work we can do towards that, the better. And it's okay to acknowledge this stuff, to have conversations with students about academic emotions. This leads us to one of our last big ideas here, which is this idea of a discourse insider. I want to mention this to you again because this idea is really important. It might not be a phrase you've heard before, but this idea of being a discourse insider can really help students tackle a complex text. Discourse means an accepted use of language that has kind of a prescribed vocabulary pool. And discourse insiders tend to have really deep knowledge of the subject area and the language used to talk about that subject. So for example, imagine that you're reading the notes, the CD liner notes on a CD of box music, or you're reading a technical manual that outlines a computer software program. If you don't have familiarity with classical music or with computer software, you're likely going to find yourself an outsider to those discourses, right? The vocabulary, the way the information is presented and talked about. Just imagine that you're a non-adult ed person sitting in a meeting, and this is the terminology that's being floated around in this meeting. This is what everybody's talking about. These are the things coming out of their mouth. You don't even know what these things mean. So of course you are a discourse outsider to adult ed if these things are unfamiliar to you, right? Imagine how your students feel when they hear this. This conversation that's happening in a text or about a text, and they don't feel like they understand the vocabulary, and they don't even understand what's going on. They feel like an outsider to the discourse. And so we want to try to bring our students to make them discourse insiders. So how would that work? Well, let's talk about first why it matters. I'm going to show you this really old study, 1988, for some of you might seem like forever ago, right? They did, Wright and Leslie did this study where they took young readers and split them into 4 groups, as seen here, gave them a text about baseball with a series of comprehension questions. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at those 4 categories and tell me which group do you think scored the highest on the assessment about the baseball article? Which of those texts do you think scored the highest? Which one of those groups? Yeah, I'm seeing people saying top left, right? The people who had the high reading ability and the high knowledge of baseball, they scored the highest. Of course they did. But guess which group scored second highest? And not by very much, they were close. It's not the other high readers. That's right. Oh, you guys are so good. I'm seeing you in the chat. You know this. That's right. The high knowledge of baseball, those are the ones who did second best, even though their reading scores were lower than that other group. That is exactly right. And you know what that tells us? That weaker readers with knowledge about the text are going to perform better. So let's draw from that how much your students know about the topic before they start reading greatly impacts their ability to read and comprehend. What your students know about the topic before they start reading greatly affects their experience in the text. Okay, so that means we got to talk about front loading, right? Front loading means before your students even read that complex text that you brought them tonight or today to that class, you've got to activate and build some knowledge that is assumed by the author. And I want to stop there just really fast to say the last phrase is really important there. That's where the gap happens. An author who is writing to other discourse insiders will make assumptions that he assumes his reader knows these things, and he'll just jump right in. Or he'll skip over the clear explanation of purpose, for instance, like we talked about earlier, right? So you might need to find this whole idea of front loading for you is before my students even open the text, what should I be doing with them to build their knowledge about this concept, right? We want to get their motivation up. We want to get them ready to productively struggle. And here's where we go. So let's talk for a second about what some of these activities might look like. These pre-reading scaffolding, in other words, the supports you put in place before they start reading, here's what some of these might look like. And these are not going to be new to you in any way. These will be familiar, right? The idea is you give them visual cues, charts, pictures, graphs, highlight things, number the paragraphs, read it out loud or play the audio. Focus on the vocab they need to see. You can do all of that even before they start reading. And then again, to point it out at the top there, then ideally over time, you would pull some of those supports away, right? So that students are doing it more independently as they go. That's the idea around the scaffolding. Now, those 4 suggestions for some pre-reading scaffolding might look really obvious to you. Let's talk about a few that you might not have thought of quite as recently or maybe never at all. One is use media, right? You can get you a YouTube video of just about everything that's out there right now. So if you're having them read something on a specific content, or maybe it's a fictional story, show a video about that content and then have them read. They can get the gist from the video, and then you can ask them to read for other purposes that push beyond just comprehension, right? They could start reading for character development, for instance, or evaluating evidence, or the text structure, once they've got the gist. So use videos. It's a great way to get students started. Another suggestion is what's called a student-directed preview. Now, this is not going to be unfamiliar to you, but this is the idea that in pairs or small groups, you'd start telling students to look at the title, the photos, the visuals, all the highlighted words, and start making a list of everything they already know about this thing based on those. What it does, this activity, it specifically makes them focus on what they already know, and it disregards everything that's unfamiliar just for the time being, okay? And I really like this strategy because, again, once you give your students a little bit of confidence, that can really help them, right, to feel better before they tackle it. It intentionally ignores what they don't know before they embark on the more rigorous examination of the knowledge in the text. So that's a strategy that you might want to try. Another one is very simple, and you've probably used it, this quick write idea. Tell the students the title or the topic of what they're going to read and ask them to write down what they already know about that topic and pass it around and let them read each other's. You know, one thing I know about Reconstruction is, and they have to fill in the blank. And then they can share those and ask each other questions about what they've written. And then they can always check and see if they were right by the end of the article. And then my favorite one is the confirming inquiring chart. Along with that qualitative analysis document, I sent a sample of this confirming inquiring chart that you'll have in your email. And it is a kind of a modified KWL. But what I love about it is that it forces students to go back and analyze whether they were right or not on their what they think they know and what they wonder. So they write what they think they know, and after they've read, they have to come back and confirm it. They literally cross out what they got wrong and correct it on the other side of the chart. And they also have this idea of what do I want to know? What am I inquiring about? And then they update it with the answers if they learned the answers from the text. And so it's a 4-quadrant chart that really, it's not just a what do I want to know, which is kind of a loose idea, but they literally have to go in the article and say, do I actually know this now? And I really like this idea. There's lots of different versions of what do I know? What do I want to know? What did I learn? That's KWL. Know, want to know, learn. But the confirming, inquiring chart is just a little more difficult. And I really like that approach because it's a little more complex. Now, that takes us to what is the end? I put this cat on here because I think he looks super smart, right? He's got a pencil to his mouth. He's got his glasses on. Part of what the idea of producing a kind of a culture of productive struggle in your classrooms is giving your students the opportunity to feel like they can do it. Students are smart enough to know that just because they get the right answer on a multiple choice question does not mean they really know how to do something. And we want to teach our students how to do, right? Not just how to get the right answer. And so our job is to not get them to understand this one particular text I'm using today, but to get them to become readers. That is a big job. So what I hope is that this session was an encouragement to you as you attempt to change the culture in your classroom so that productive struggle is encouraged by you and embraced by your students. Think about that for a minute. You have to encourage productive struggle, and then your students can embrace it, right? And so I really hope that this can be done for you by some really careful planning, some careful selection of texts, and implementing some of the strategies that we've talked about today. I am really grateful that you stuck around with me today and listened. We will look through the chat and see if there are questions that really need to be answered, and I'll email and give you those answers. And I'll double check. Oh yeah, I saw somebody asked about the resource that I quoted at the beginning. I will send that to, I'll put it in the chat here. Great. Yep, Sharon, I'll turn it over to you. And I'm going to answer this resource question about the book I quoted at the beginning.
Wonderful. Well, Anita, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for this wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask everybody to take a moment to fill out our quick poll. While you're doing that, our friend Robert from Burlington English has a few words to say as well.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to share a quick slide. Thank you very, very much, Anita. I know I walked away with a lot of information from that. And to all of you, hope to see you at burlingtonenglish.com. Just a ton of resources. And again, if you're thinking about student recruitment, we'd love to provide for you, again, totally free of charge, our complimentary student recruitment kit. It really, really can go a long way, and we'd love to customize it for you. And so again, burlingtonenglish.com, whether you're looking to recruit students on the web, smartphone apps, or just good old-fashioned paper flyers around town. Once again, we have an entire customer care team that's customizing this for folks all over the country. So just visit us at burlingtonenglish.com, and it's part of our Act Now webinar. Thanks so much. And again, wonderful job, Anita. I learned a lot. Thank you, Sharon.
Great. Thank you. Anita, any last words before we go?
No, just to say thank you for having me, and I look forward to hopefully seeing everybody virtually at the COAB conference.
Yes. Thank you so much, everybody. We appreciate your time. Bye now.
Bye-bye.